Hello. It's been a bit. Sorry I haven't been making videos. Kind of been not feeling it. I don't know. Just the desire has not been there particularly. Um, and it's Thursday. It's St. Patrick's Day. And usually on Thursday nights is when have been filming my weekly wrap-ups so I can post them on Friday. But I didn't do one last week and I didn't do one the week before. And I don't really want to do one tonight. But Juan made a tag, his first original tag. And I want to do that because Juan is great and he's a great guy and I want to do his tag. I didn't do it right away because I wasn't really feeling like videos. But I did some thoughts, collected my thoughts. I actually wrote down and thought out what my answers were going to be before I shot the video, which is not how I usually do it. I didn't take notes or anything. I just picked the things I was going to talk about for each question. And we'll do this, and then we'll see how I feel, and maybe we'll do a weekly wrap up, and maybe we won't. We will find out. But so this is the Faces of Horror. So this I love this idea. We're talking about how horror is such a wide-ranging thing. You can do so many different things with horror, and so we're going to talk about different horror stories that have elicited different reactions from us. He did word it in a way with story so that we could go with book or movie or whatever. This is going to be mostly movie focused. Just I'm more literate in movie horror. I'm pretty literate in movie horror. I'm not super literate in book horror. So yeah, we're just gonna jump into it. The first prompt is, what is a horror story that has scared or disturbed you? There are a lot of things I could choose for this prompt. The thing that I was very close to choosing was Antichrist, the Lars von Trier movie, which is a favorite of mine. But I went with one that I like maybe a little bit less, but is maybe a little bit more disturbing and scary and upsetting, which is Martyrs, the 2008 French film by Pascal Laugier, maybe the most infamous of the New French Extreme movement of the late 90s and 2000s. Not the most famous necessarily, but maybe the most infamous of that era of French cinema. I will say that there isn't really a good way to talk about this movie without kind of ruining it a little bit. I'm going to try to be as vague as possible when I talk about why this movie is scary and disturbing. So it centers around two young women, and it's a movie about, at the beginning at least, revenge. One of the two women when she was, this isn't really a spoiler, this happens in the very beginning of the movie. She's abducted and tortured, physically tortured, not sexually tortured, but she's abducted and confined and tortured for an extended period of time, but manages to escape and get away. But as you can imagine, is very fucked up because of that. And she believes that she has found the people who are responsible for doing this to her, now 15 years later or whatever. She's in her 20s, and her and her best friend, who they grew up in an orphanage together. They go to confront and see if these are in fact the people who did it, but things get kind of out of hand, and there's a couple points in the movie where there's like a significant twist, something very unexpected happens, and it goes in a direction that you maybe do not foresee. I remember the first time I watched this movie, there's like a moment, maybe like 5 minutes into the movie, where something happens just like so quickly into the movie that is so wild that I was like on my couch, like laying down, and I sat up. I physically sat up because I was like, oh, okay, this is what we're doing now. This is not like a laying down movie. Her trauma takes the form of hallucinations of this very graphic and disgusting humanoid monster that is attacking her, but of course it's her. She's doing self-harm, and it's very graphic. It's very hard to watch. It is very upsetting and unpleasant. And this movie does descend into what a lot of people would probably pejoratively dub as like torture porn, which was a big thing, in the late 2000s. This is around when Hostel came out. However, I think that Hostel, it is doing those things for the spectacle, like it's about like, let's be as extreme as we can because being extreme is fun, like kind of edgy. It's Eli Roth, that's kind of his thing. Martyrs is a movie with a philosophy behind it. And the philosophy is about like moral responsibility and the greater good, right? Like what are the limits of doing bad things to a couple people to do really good things for a lot of people? This is a question that philosophers have asked for forever, and we have many famous and important historical moments to point at, like the scientific experimentations, non-consensual experimentations of the Nazis, as well as the Japanese during World War II, or even, something like the Tuskegee syphilis experiments that the American government, non-consensually performed on black people in southern part of America in the early 20th century. These are evil things. They are awful. Some of the worst things that you can do to people. But there is still, despite that, this sort of silver lining, which is just such an awful thing to even have to admit, that good things came of some of the worst things that have ever happened. And I think that horror as a genre is better equipped than any other to posit these dichotomies to us, to make us uncomfortable with these truths, and to confront us with them, and to, force us to ask ourselves where we stand and how we feel about these things. And I think that Laguier probably comes down on the side of these are bad. We should, do not do these things. Do not do terrible things for the greater good. But it is still a really interesting and thought-provoking sort of way to talk about evil. And I think that, like, most people, I see, like, on TikTok, there's this guy on TikTok who goes out on the street, and, like, he's like a young kid, he's in college probably, and he gets other college age kids. He does trivia on the street, 5 trivia questions. If you get them all right, you get like $10 or something. And people are very stupid. That's basically what I'm getting at, is that people are very stupid. Most people are stupid. As George Carlin once said, think about how stupid the average person is, and now realize that half of everyone is stupider than that. But, so when you watch, big movies for the masses, they aren't asking you usually to interrogate yourself with these kinds of questions the way that Martyrs does, or other great works of art. And I would say that, other notable torture porn movies like Hostel aren't really asking you these big questions either. And that's why Hostel is fine, and I think Martyrs is, one of the best horror movies of the last 20 years. So, yeah. And Scared or Disturbed, it's obviously it's disturbing and upsetting because of all of these disturbing and upsetting things that happen in it, but it's also scary because it reminds me of the capabilities of people to do really, really, really bad stuff when they can justify it to themselves. As long as they feel like they're doing the right thing, people are capable of doing really, really scary shit. And then you take Psych 101 in college, you learn all about Milgram and all of that stuff. It's not new, but it's like, it's still good to kind of like remind yourself of that every once in a while, that people are scary monsters, and that the scary monsters can be all around you. Second question, a horror story that depressed you or made you cry. A lot of the choices I have in here I can kind of like slot into different categories. But for this one, I chose to go with Titan, which I just rewatched the day before yesterday, which is the fourth time I have now watched that movie since it came out 5 months ago. Titan makes me cry. It doesn't depress me. There are other movies that depress me, for sure. Horror movies that depress me much more. I thought about putting Possession, Andrzej Zulawski's Possession, in here. Titan makes me cry. And again, I don't want to say too much about the plot of the movie, because it's like part of the appeal of the movie to me, part of what makes the movie brilliant, is that it goes in directions that you're not expecting it to. But I will say this. Despite being extremely upsetting and fucked up at times, it is at its core, I think, an incredibly sweet story. An incredibly moving, sweet study of two human beings. And they are two people who are hopelessly damaged people. Just sort of terminally unable to be people anymore. But through a series of incredible events, they find each other, and despite all odds, manage to give one another what they need to be better. And part of this relationship has a sort of father and son dynamic to it. And that's the thing that really fucks me up. What can I say? I have issues there in my life, with my dad and our relationship. And there's a part in this movie where the older character says to the younger, basically what he says is that, like, it doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter, nothing matters. You are my son. You are always going to be my son, no matter what. And that just fucking kills me every time, because I just, that I never had that. I never got to have that. Um, yeah, it's a movie that's very rough and sweet, and it is frightening, but it is also hopeful. Um, it is a movie about the capability of human beings to become better than they were. And that there is no. It's never too late, I guess. And it's a pretty rare thing to find in a horror movie. Horror movies are usually a lot more bleak than that. And this one has bleakness, but what it does instead is it uses tropes of horror, body horror particularly, to talk about change, to talk about how people change. People's bodies change. When they become pregnant, people's bodies change when they transition from a gender that they were assigned at birth to a gender of their choice. They might take hormones or have surgeries to change their body. People's capability and capacity to love can change as they grow to learn how to love themselves or learn how to love others through loving themselves, or vice versa. Or people can change into monsters, like in a supernatural sense, in a horror movie. All of those things are present in Titan. It's all about change. The whole movie is about human beings and their ability to change in every conceivable way. And I have really found so much solace in that, and in reminding myself that I too have the capability to be better and change, and that I am better than the worst things that I have done in my life. And I think we all are. Yeah. Let's change the topic a little bit. Number 3, a horror story that made you laugh. For this one, again, I could have chosen so many. I've decided to go with Street Trash. So Street Trash is one of the most legendary sort of like shock horror comedy movies of the VHS boom of the 1980s. The only directorial feature by J. Michael Murrow came out in 1987. And it's one of the... There's a whole like sort of subgenre of body horror called melt movies, where people melt, basically. And this is one of the more famous ones. There's this one in Body Melt, which is also a horror comedy. But this is a movie about this bodega finds this like ancient box of bottles of liquor called Viper, right? I think. And in like behind a wall in a crawl space, and they decide to sell it to all the hobos. It's in New York, in the 80s, like pre-Giuliani New York, so the good New York. And unfortunately, drinking the Viper has the side effect of making you melt into colorful puddles of goo.
Wizzy, you homo! Jesus.
And the plot, what little plot there is, there's this sort of like camp of homeless people that's being run by this sort of like psychotic Vietnam vet in this sort of like weird Mad Max fantasy land that he lives in. And then there are like two brothers who are trying to live their life, and he doesn't like that, and they are at odds with one another. But then also there's this, people are melting, and it's just silly. It doesn't really matter. It's just really silly. Like there's a part where a guy there's definitely a part where a guy fucks a dead body, but then there's also a part where a guy gets his dick cut off, and then everybody plays keep away with his severed penis, and it's like a long scene. It's like a 5-minute scene of everyone just like throwing this like pickle in the middle, or monkey in the middle, with his dick, with like a rubber dick that they're just like throwing around in slow motion, arcing through the air. Very silly movie, very dumb movie, but fun as hell to put on at a party. You know, if you have people over to watch movies, highly recommend Street Trash. It's not streaming on anything, unfortunately. It's kind of you can't really like, you can't even like rent it, you know, to stream. I think it used to be on Shudder, but it's not anymore. So you kind of have to track down a copy of it. I have a DVD of it, but it's definitely worth your time. If you're into super gory stuff, it's got some incredible practical effects, and it's also just really fun. If you're a Trauma fan, for sure this is going to be up your alley. I'm not like Trauma is pretty hit and miss for me. Like sometimes I think that they really knock it out of the park, and a lot of the times it completely falls flat for me. Like I love the first Toxic Avenger, and I love the first Nukem High, and then all of the sequels to those movies I feel like are just like unbearably awful and like unwatchably bad. But that's just me. I love Street Trash though. This movie fucking rocks, and it's one of my favorite movies. So yeah, and it's just a good old time. 4. A horror story that made you angry. I've chosen to angry is kind of like a complicated emotion, right? My answer here is Hereditary. There aren't that many things that make me angry in like a traditional sense. The only things that make me, movies and things, art, that makes me angry is when it's like so bad that it feels like existentially upsetting to me, where I'm like, people shouldn't be allowed to do this. People got money. I don't get money. I didn't get to make a movie, but this fucker did, you know, and that's not fair, and that makes me angry. But I've chosen not to go that direction. I can't really think of any horror movies that I hate that much. There aren't very many movies that, in general, that I hate that much. It's, you know, things like Baby Geniuses 2, or Food Fight, or Kirk Cameron's Saving Christmas. You know, movies that are like, are going overboard with Adam Sandler. Movies that are painful movies, movies that are like, you could weaponize, like Guantanamo movies. Horror is usually, there's at least something for me to enjoy. So I've chosen to take this in a different direction, and with Hereditary. And what I mean when I say angry, that made me angry, it's more like upset, I guess, and more sort of like an angry in a way where I just sort of feel anger, like, about how unfair life can be, in a very selfish way, in a very self-centered way, where I look at my life and bad things that have happened to me and feel angry about them and how you know, bad things were done to me and I had no power. I didn't get to choose, and it's not fair. And how hurt people hurt other people, and how a lot of people who have children shouldn't. And I feel like I'm maybe a product of that. And that's all sort of what Hereditary is about, right? I mean, it's right there in the title, even though for the most part it's a metaphor, you know, in the context of the story. But just the idea that the whole movie is about, you know, mental illness or trauma and how we pass these things along to our children and our grandchildren through our children. You know, we are fucked up and we fuck those up who we raise, and then they fuck their children up, you know, forever. And you know, we do our best. Some of us do, at least. You know, I have a few good friends with children, some of whom are pretty, you know, normal people who don't have mental illness, and others who do, you know. And you know, it is like, you know, when you see people who do struggle a lot and they have children, it's like, you know, you do everything you can, but you're always going to make mistakes, and you're never going to be perfect, and you're never going to be there every time you need to be. It's just inevitable. And there is something very sad and unfair about that for everybody, you know? Nobody wins in that scenario. There are certainly parents who don't even care, you know? And my friends who are parents, they definitely do. They definitely do care and do everything they can to be as good of a parent as they possibly can be. But maybe not. Maybe, you know, the other parent, you know, of the child, maybe they're not very good. Maybe they don't care. You know, it's just like, at the end of the day, the world is very cruel. It's very beautiful too at times. And there are very wonderful things in it that make all of it worthwhile, I suppose. But it is also very cruel and unfair. And there's a lot of suffering, and there doesn't always need to be. A lot of the suffering isn't necessary, you know. Most of our suffering we have brought upon ourselves. And Hereditary reminded me of that a lot. It really kind of holds a mirror up to us and reminds us that, you know, we do these things to each other and the people we love, or the people we think we love. And it doesn't feel good. It's an upsetting ass movie. It's really not a fun movie to watch at all. I don't want to say, you know, there are a few scenes that I could talk about, but I don't want to spoil anything for if you haven't seen this movie. As you know, it's a pretty well known and kind of has become like an instant modern classic at this point. Ari Aster, you know, kind of really knocked it out of the park with his first two movies. That and Midsummer. I don't know. I just it's tough. It's a tough watch. It upsets me, so that's why I picked it. Number 5, a horror story that's important to you. For this one, I chose Negative Space by B.R. Yeager. I have a full review of this book from when I read it, a year ago, on this channel. You can watch if you want to get my full thoughts. I will just say that, once again, I feel like this is a story about, like, trying to find purpose and hope and meaning in a place and a time where there is very little. You really feel the weight of the world on the characters in Negative Space. And they are, surrounded by death, by suicide. They're surrounded by decay. Everything is wet and moldy and falling apart. And all of them really just want to not think about it. They want to get high. They want to fuck. They want to do whatever they need to do to not have to confront how close to the end they already are. And I was right there with them, more than once. I've been right on that precipice myself. And it's really beautiful to reach a point where you can step back from it and feel safe. And that's how Negative Space made me feel. And God bless that book for having the power to do that. It's pretty incredible. And 6, a non-horror story that you consider horror. For this one, I have chosen Persona, the 1966 film by Ingmar Bergman. It's funny because I feel like, culturally, historically, The Seventh Seal was always Bergman's most famous, most significant movie. But in the last 10 years or so, Persona has kind of like risen up and taken the spot. When you look at him on Letterboxd, which sorts the movies by most popular, Persona is his most popular movie now. It's not Seventh Seal anymore. Hour of the Wolf, which came out just a couple years later. Persona was 66, and Hour of the Wolf was 68. Hour of the Wolf is for sure a horror movie, a horror story. Often people will be like, it's Bergman's horror movie, like it's the only one. I do think, though, that Persona is horror. Because it's very sort of surreal and dreamlike. And, but I think that the sort of idea, the conceit behind the movie is a scary idea. It's a scary feeling. And the idea is basically like losing yourself, losing your grasp on who you are. It's about two people in isolation who start to sort of meld into one person and lose their sort of identity. They lose their ego, and they lose their grip on reality, which is pretty scary if you think about it. Not being able to sort of self-conceptualize and like not knowing where you end and someone else begins, and not knowing what's real and what's not, or what's you and what's not, like, confusion is fear. That's something that maybe a lot of people don't think about. Maybe I'm wrong, but confusion is fear. Uncertainty is fear, because fear is not knowing what's going to happen. Dread is like knowing what's going to happen and being like not so super pumped about it, but fear is like what's around the corner. I don't know, you know. Is something bad going to happen? I don't know. It's uncertainty. And that's the root of fear. And I think that Persona does an incredible job at creating this sort of filmic world of uncertainty and portraying what it feels like to just sort of slip away into someone else. And you can take it in a lot of ways, because it's like, you know, as someone who has like codependent tendencies in relationships, like I see myself in that. I see the desire to just sort of lose the self and invest everything into the other. You know, when you don't like yourself, the appeal of leaving yourself and being someone else is pretty strong. But it's also really scary to lose control, you know, to not be the master of your own domain or whatever. So I think that Persona is horror, even though nobody says it is. I'm here to make that statement. It's also one of my favorite movies ever. Like I don't know, you know, historically when I made top 10s and stuff, it was a top 10, maybe top 5. It might be a little lower. It's probably still a top 10 movie for me, but favorite Bergman for sure. Just an incredible movie. Some of the best acting ever in a movie, I think. Bibi Anderson and Liv Ullmann in that movie, just out of control good. So yeah, all right, that's it. Those 6 prompts. This video is not 2 hours long, so that's cool. So yeah, we will see what the future holds for this channel. I know that like nobody is waiting with bated breath. You know, I don't have a following large enough to have, you know, community around me or whatever, so it doesn't really matter. Even if I did, I'm not beholden to anybody. But just know that, you know, I'm always thinking about it, and if videos come, they come, and if they don't, they don't. Yeah. So thanks to Juan for making this awesome tag, so that we can talk about the power of horror. I love horror, and most of my favorite things, at least a little bit, have horror going on in them, because I think that horror is, like I said, you know, fear and horror are about the unknown, and most of what I love are things that want us to question ourselves and try to understand things that we don't, you know, try to grow and try to further ourselves. And the only way to do that is to confront our fears and work through them. And what better way to do that than horror, you know, which is explicitly about that. So there are horrifying things about plenty of things that aren't horror, but horror is simple, and I appreciate that about it. All right. Good night.